So I start by asking, what kind of America will your grandchildren live in? Will they occupy an America in which the great disparities in wealth have been overcome? Will they live in a country in which they can look forward to a better future? Will they live in an America that has healed its divisions of race, gender, and ethnicity? Perhaps not perfectly, but wherein people across lines of difference can appreciate, respect, and maybe even empathize with the experience of others. Will they live in a nation that has overcome the dislocations of poverty, a nation proud of its schools and educational achievements, and a nation in which people are freed from the economic anxieties that come with illness, old age, and disability? Will the America of our grandchildren be a democratic America in which they can participate in the improvement of their lives and will feel that they count in shaping their society? Will our children live in an open society and breathe the fresh air of truthfulness, where the lights of science and reason will enable them to feel uplifted, where being informed, knowledgeable, and competent will win the respect of others? Will they live in a free society in which their rights to think as they wish and to say what they think will be upheld? And will our grandchildren live in an America wherein they can be imbued with a sense of optimism that the lives of their children will be better even than their own? Or will our grandchildren live in an America which is far more dark and grim? Will they live in a society in which their private lives will remain intact, in which they will still be able to go to their jobs each morning and return at home at night, wherein they can enjoy a Sunday barbecue in their backyard with their neighbors and thereby sustain an ambience of normalcy? Will they enjoy the blandishments and diversions of material possessions? But at the same time, will it be a society wherein the obscenely and immorally wealthy control and manipulate the political system and government to further their own power and privilege? Will they occupy a society in which poverty grows exponentially and the festering anger and rage of the poor is kept in check by ever more powerful militarized police forces occupying their neighborhoods in order to maintain an oppressive and formal peace? Will those police powers be legitimized by the curtailment of civil liberties and fundamental freedoms? Will our courts, which are meant to protect those freedoms, lose their independence and increasingly become the subordinated tools of the executive branch, which is again the political expression of the privileged and powerful? Will the media owned by major corporate interests be no more than the mouthpieces of the government and those who occupy the seats of political and corporate power, thus denying the people at large access to competing viewpoints and ideas? Will our grandchildren live in an America not unified by a common vision based on our founding principles, but one which is viciously divided by class, the haves and have-nots, by race and ethnicity, with a hatred deliberately stoked by those controlling the reins of power in order to keep the people divided and suppressing a united opposition to those in control? Will our grandchildren live in a society in which a full-blown and explicit and shameless misogyny is restored, and the agency of women as equal, empowered, and dignified human beings is suppressed? And will our grandchildren live in a democracy, but a democracy in name only, a nation that holds periodic elections, but elections which will be virtually meaningless because those running for office are all part of the same institutionalized, corrupt, and oppressive system? In a word, will it be a government comprised not of statespersons in a free system, but apparatchiks who are cogs in an oppressive governmental and political universe built on power, privilege, and hierarchy? Let me put my cards on the table. I do not think that the America of our grandchildren that they will inherit will be a replica of the fascism of the 1930s. But I do think that a society has to be expressive, does not have to be expressive of a full-blown fascism in order to have fascistic elements that define and characterize it. And it is my conclusion that America at this political moment displays many of those elements. It is those elements, some more fully formed than others, that are shaping the moods of many Americans in these very challenging and, I would argue, dark times. It is these moods that I want to discuss this morning, and therefore the intent and focus of my talk, although seemingly political, is ultimately and primarily pastoral. And for those of us who are attuned to the political world, as most of us ethical culturists are, the emotional effects of the political reality we live in can be very Politics and political realities are pervasive and influence our personal lives in ways in which few aspects of the human experience do. In a certain sense, everything people do is political, or at least has political consequences. I personally have trouble with the person who says, quote, I am not into politics, or politics doesn't interest me, as if being interested in politics were nothing more than a matter of taste. I prefer chocolate to pistachio. I suppose one could live one's life being totally indifferent to art, to music, or to sports. But the political realm, I argue, is different, because it shapes and determines the fundamental conditions of our public and private lives. Who wields power and who doesn't? Who benefits from the economy and who is deprived? Who is privileged and who suffers under the oppressions and boot heels of injustice? To claim that one is not interested in politics, I think, is to turn one's back on one's basic obligations as a citizen and as a member of society. And this, in my view, is a type of moral lapse in a way in which shunning art or music or athletics is not. My own philosophy is such that we are all social creatures, and we live our lives within a web of social obligations to the welfare of others. And as such, it is incumbent on us to be involved in the life of the community, the broader society to whatever degree, and therefore to be politically informed and engaged. This is what Aristotle meant when he said that the human being is its own politikon, that is, that the human being is a political animal. Our lives are wrapped up in the lives of the community, and so is our very humanity, inclusive of our psyches, our sense of well-being, our moods, and our emotions. It's very obvious, I think, that our emotions and moods, our inner lives, are molded and informed both by internal psychological dynamics specific to us. These arise from a complex mix of our neurology, our genetic endowments, and what I like to call temperament, which I think pretty much is inborn. But of course, the external world, the world of other people, including the political world, informs our emotions and moods as well. And the membrane between the inner life and the outer world is very porous. Our emotions as unique people at any moment are a product of many causes that make up our internal and external lives. Again, this is all quite obvious and I think commonsensical. When we look at the contemporary scene, perhaps there has not been a time in recent memory in which so many Americans have felt themselves as influenced, I want to say assaulted, by political realities as they are at this moment. I personally have lived through almost, when I think of it, 1/3 of the history of the United States. Okay, some of you have lived through more, I know, in this room, some through less. And I contend that the times that we are experiencing now are unique, and the emotional effects they are having on large numbers of Americans, I think, are unprecedented. And I know this because of conversations that people have with me. Like many of you, I have lived through the McCarthy period, although I frankly, to be honest, don't remember the McCarthy period. I remember McCarthy himself. You do. I don't. Well, that means you're probably older than I am, or have a much better memory, Carolyn, than I do. Okay, like many of you, I've lived through the McCarthy period, the fears of the Cold War, culminating, and this I do remember very well, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was 20 days when we were walking around really feeling that there was a plausible, if not very good likelihood, that humanity was about to destroy itself. That is not hyperbole. For those who were too young to remember it, we were walking around, I was in high school in those days, walking around feeling that the end of the world was indeed a very plausible reality. I lived, of course, as you did, through the Civil Rights Movement, the seemingly endless agony of the Vietnam War, the craziness of the 1960s, which I must admit I'm guilty of helping to create. Perhaps most unnerving, the urban riots of that period and political assassinations. We lived through the criminality of Richard Nixon, and given my own political point of view, the ultra-conservatism of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and then, of course, the terrorist assaults of 9/11, which introduced new elements of fear and insecurity into the American psyche. Yet, I would argue that there is something different, more deep-reaching and comprehensive now, and it is upsetting in ways in which the previous episodes and convulsions were not. In an op editorial published in the New York Times on December 25th, written by Michelle Goldberg, which got a lot of buzz, by the way, entitled, quote, "Democracy Grief is Real." Speaking of the Trump phenomenon, she said, quote, "Obviously, this is hardly the first time that America has failed to live up to its ideals. But the ideals themselves used to be merely a universal lodestar. The civil rights movement and the freedom movements that came after it succeeded because the country could be shamed by the distance between its democratic promises and its reality. That is no longer true," end quote. With that insight, I think Michelle Goldberg got it exactly correct, and its implications are far-reaching and I think very unsettling. What is fading, I think, is a commitment to America's founding and unifying principles. What's fading is a commitment to the foundational principles which Americans would rally around to create, in an effort to create a more perfect union. But even more so, what has been lost is a commitment to the most basic norms which provide the glue that hold together a unified society, I would argue, of any type. And that, in effect, is new. I don't think we've ever confronted that. While the dynamics of social division have always been present, it is quite phenomenal how quickly not only democratic and constitutional norms are being undermined, but the very norms of honesty and truth-telling, of reason, of the importance of evidence in establishing the credibility of claims, of the authority of science, and generally a respect for learning and expertise. I would say, if people who disagree cannot point to reason and warranted truths which are impartial and neutral by which to attempt to overcome their differences and disputes and achieve compromise, then the result is that they will lapse into tribalism, each tribe nursing its own subjective truths, and the only way in which differences ultimately can be overcome is through power struggles. This reality makes social divisions virtually inevitable, and this is the reality that we are now living in, and I think it's rather grim. Reason, admittedly, is a very weak reed, and when stacked up against powerful emotions driven by tribal impulses that prey on people's needs to be part of an in-group, reason may well be the loser. Hence, we see the emergence and impact of bizarre and outlandish conspiracy theories which too many people are too prepared to accept and which reason is almost impotent to counteract. There are many dynamics in our culture that inflame the social divisions we witness. There has been lately a spate of articles on the damaging influence of the internet and social networking which cries out for regulation. The internet is here. We're not going to put the horse back in the barn, and in many ways the internet is a phenomenal, world-changing tool, no doubt about it. I use it for information. I use it as an academic in terms of pulling up reports on human rights that I need, and a lot of other stuff. I use it like a lot of people do. At this point, there's a utility. I mean, it's there. It's like my toaster. I mean, it's used. No doubt, when Silicon Valley created the internet, the vision was promising and overwhelmingly benign. The connectivity of people directly to each other and access to virtually a limitless amount of information would be a tremendous boon to democracy. An informed public is indeed the lifeblood of democracy. So what could be bad about exposing the public to a preponderance of news and information coming from a multitude of sources expressing the widest diversity of opinion? What was not foreseen, I think, in the beginning was the power of the internet through algorithmic aggregation to create an avalanche of targeted, erroneous, slanderous, hateful, and destructive information which threatens to overwhelm trusted sources of authority and information that are necessary for responsible and civically engaged populace to function democratically. In many quarters, fantastical, conspiratorial, bad, and bigoted information appealing to people's worst instincts is driving out the good. That's not good. And is there anything new or different that can be said about Donald Trump that has not already been said? Okay. It is the nature of human projection that the President of the United States is understood not only to be a political leader, but a moral one as well. And given his morality, he's the type of leader you want to keep your kids away from. I mean, really, that's a big problem for parents, right? When Donald Trump comes on the scene, what do you do with your kids? Yet, I think Trump is a perverted caricature of the holder of high office, which the most imaginative literary artist could hardly conjure up. Here is a president who has lied at least 13,000 times since taking office. Here is a public servant who has no commitment to the public good, owing to feeding his own infantile narcissism. And Trump has virtually no commitment to constitutional and democratic principles, a mainstay of which is an appreciation of checks and balances. He is contemptuous of any government or public entity, such as the media, which attempts to put limits on his power or even criticize him in the slightest. Trump is the embodiment of a political autocrat, and as we know all too well, it is autocrats whom he admires most. Be it Kim Jong-un of North Korea, which is the world's most repressive society, Erdogan of Turkey, Viktor Orban of Hungary, and most of all, of course, Vladimir Putin, while he holds in contempt the leaders of democratic societies. For Trump, America truly is a blood and soil nation, and not a country built on lofty democratic principles. Trump's values are an inversion of American principles, and as such, given the power and authority of his office, his behavior, I think, is emotionally destabilizing. Now he is confronting his first international crisis as the tension with Iran is being ratcheted up. Believe me, I have always been skeptical of our national policymakers, especially when it comes to the global assertion of American power and war making. Look at the horror of George Bush and creating the war in Iraq, which is the worst foreign policy blunder we have ever created in the history of the United States. $1 trillion, 100,000 Iraqis lost, 5,000 American soldiers, and indeed the Middle East is in chaos, and the end point is Iran, our arch enemy, is now controlling Iraq as they did not before. What a stupid mistake built on a total lie. No, indeed, Saddam Hussein was not giving weapons of mass destruction to Osama bin Laden. It was false, and we knew it to be false. So look, I have no rosy sense of the honesty of previous presidents and so on. But again, I think that Donald Trump, by virtue of his temperament, arrogance, and ignorance, is in a category all his own. But so I'm asking, can we put any trust whatsoever in Donald Trump in making informed, prudent, and wise decisions when our security, American security, hangs in the balance? Okay, only a naive fool, I believe, would do so. When it comes down to the wire, Trump's ignorance, arrogance, and incompetence in international affairs, where the stakes are highest, is another source of discomfort, despair, and I think fear. Just this morning, I read the New York Times a lot. Some people who know me may think it's my Bible, but I don't take it literally, and I don't think it is in effect. I don't take the Times literally, and I don't think it's infallible, okay? I tend to take a critical stance for it. But, you know, it was Morris Raphael Cohen, who is a famed philosopher at City College in the 1930s, when City College was known as a young man's Harvard. Couldn't go to Harvard, but you could go to City College, right? Morris Raphael Cohen was a great professor of philosophy, who for a small time was actually a leader in training in the ethical culture movement, right? And he had once said, and I sort of like this observation, that reading the newspaper is the modern person's version of prayer, okay? And it's true for me. I was prayerful until I was about 12, okay? 13, until I had my bar mitzvah. And then I became an atheist very quickly. I stopped saying my prayers, and it was around the age of 12 or 13 that I started reading the New York Times. And you know what? I read it every day. You know, that's it. I can't help myself. It's a habit, you know, not that I believe everything. So anyway, well, I got to tell you, in the age of alternative facts, going to a news source that at least tries to be responsible and objective is refreshing. I'll settle for that, you know. Even reading conservative opinion makers, okay, I enjoy if they're intelligent in putting something together, which I think is coherent and warrants my interest. Anyway, just today, main headline, I'm reading today's paper, right? I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I have to read the paper. My cup of coffee, 2 cups of coffee, New York Times. So the lead headline is Trump's choice of killing stunned defense officials. Now this I find very unnerving. Let me just read 2 paragraphs. This is the main article today. It says, quote, starting, it says, in the chaotic days leading to the death of Major General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful commander, top military officials put the option of killing him, which they viewed as the most extreme response to recent Iranian-led violence in Iraq, on the menu they presented to President Trump. They didn't think he would take it. In the wars waged since September 11, 2001 attacks, Pentagon officials have often offered improbable options to presidents to make other possibilities appear more palatable. Got the strategy? Okay. Then 2 paragraphs down it says, by late Thursday, the president had gone for the extreme option. Last sentence. Top Pentagon officials were stunned. My goodness, what if one of the options, which they were smart enough not to put on the table, was the nuclear option? I ask myself, would Trump have the restraint, the wherewithal, the temperament to resist it? Or the brains? I am not so sure. Okay, I am not. I think we live in dangerous times. But of course, there's much more. By virtue of his office, the President of the United States should serve as a unifier, bringing together those who support him and his partisans, as well as those who oppose his politics and policies. Yet Trump's commitment is to dividing sectors of the American public against each other and using the most vile, vulgar tactics and name-calling to do it, whether it be Democrats, liberals, his own intelligence services, the FBI, the CIA, and his generals, and an expanding list of notables whom he hates. Trump has made an enemy, indeed, of half the country. It seems that no one has spared his enemy list except perhaps Ivanka and Jared. He hasn't gotten around that yet. But most dangerous, I think, and most dangerous and most serious, and most upsetting, is his scapegoating of minorities. That has such a bad resonance and feel. The scapegoating of minorities, whether it be immigrants, whether it be vulnerable and traumatized asylum seekers fleeing persecution, Muslims, African Americans, and yes, he is a racist, okay? The disabled, Jews, women, among others. A component of Trump's makeup reflected in his policies, I believe, is, to put it out there, is simply cruelty and sadism. There is no subtlety or sophistication in him, just adolescent assertions of brute force and bullying. Trump does this in order to use hatred to stir up his base, but it is also in the service of creating a racist America. It is an appeal to an earlier era, an era of imagined white purity. His quote, "Make America Great Again," has resonance with the America First movement, comprised of Nazi sympathizers of the 1940s, when more than 20,000, some in Nazi uniforms, gathered in Madison Square Garden to herald the Nazi cause and try to keep America out of the war. Trump's is an appeal to racial and ethnic homogeneity and purity, and friends, there is no way around it. This is fascist rhetoric and fascist tactics. I don't know any other way to basically define it. It is amazing how much destruction our basic norms one man can create in such a short period of time. But our circumstances and the malaise they generate go far beyond the assaults of a single leader. Trump is indeed not only a cause, but also a symptom. They burrow far deeper than one person alone, however powerful, and this I find even more ominous, more disturbing, and more frightening than Trump himself. The Roman Empire was able to survive 400 years of crazy emperors at the top because at ulterior levels of governance it had a strong and solid civil service, a well and stable and loyal military, and a very sophisticated system of law. Trump's abuses are, of course, well known. A great danger is that we will become blasé about them and accept them as the new normal, which is perhaps what his incessant outlandishness is intended to do. In my view, whether our grandchildren will inhabit a democratic America or will survive within a grimmer political environment reflective of what has come to be called illiberal democracy, a nominal democracy with fascist undercurrents, will ultimately depend on the strength of our underlying democratic institutions. That's what will save us. Okay. What concerns me the most is not that we have our own Caligula sitting on the throne, but the sycophantic subservience, and forgive me here, it would be naive and irresponsible not to be partisan, okay? To be the sycophantic subservience of the Republican members of the House and the Senate, who give virtually blind obeisance to Trump in order to preserve their own petty power and self-serving careers. I am not the only one to ask, where is their loyalty to the Constitution? When Mitch McConnell says we're going to conspire with the White House over the impeachment trial, I say to myself, if this is a trial and senators are jurors, is it appropriate, indeed, for the defendant to be basically to be conspiring with the jury in terms of the outcome? I mean, it's such a violation of basic judicial principles that, you know, one asks, where is the loyalty to the Constitution? Where is their patriotism and love of country? Where is their defense of democracy? Where is their commitment to truth and to principle? Where, for heaven's name, is their conscience? How can they explain to their children the subservience to this immoral, incompetent, and unhinged leader? Where even is their loyalty to the best values of their own party, even if they are values that, for the most part, I personally don't share? The willingness of these men to cave to the president for the sake of their own narrow interests speaks to an ominous weakness in our democratic fiber and foundations at this time. They may, in fact, win another term in office in the next election, only to find that they will have helped to destroy the very democratic system that sustains that office, or any political office worth having. Wasn't it Jesus who says, what meriteth a man if he gain the entire world but lose his soul? I mean, one gets a sense, what does it behoove a Republican congressman to win another election if the democratic system which enables him to get there has basically fallen apart? I mean, we can ask that question, right? It is not unheard of in the history of this country for a statesperson, out of principle and conscience, to stand up to denounce wrongdoing and then resign to make a point and to preserve his or her honor in the process. But to my knowledge, not a single leader in Trump's party has done so. And this I find most disturbing, to the point of being almost incomprehensible. Not a single one. Indeed, there are conservative congressmen who said they're not going to run again. But why in the world doesn't one have the guts and the moral conscience to stand up to denounce, okay, this president, okay, and to do it and use their resignation as a statement in the process of doing that? That's happened in the history where occasionally conscientious people have done that. If you want to ask me who, okay, I was checking my memory who. I remember very well when Clinton gutted the welfare law, okay, in a way that was injurious to children on people welfare. Peter Edelman, who was the head of that department, very publicly resigned from that position, saying, I could not institute a policy which does so much damage. We have had that in the history of our nation. I don't see a single Republican, senator or member of the House, having enough moral fiber, conscience, guts, whatever it takes to stand up and do it. Not one. That's very dispiriting to me. That person, from my point of view, would be a moral hero. But no. Most of us have grown up on the implicit assumption that the American system of liberal democracy, despite its great limitations and faults, is here to stay. That we are resting on a time-tested foundation that we can happily take for granted. Most of us assume that the system we have inherited will always be here as assuredly as the sun will rise tomorrow. We need to tweak it and perfect it, but the basic framework we assume, take for granted, is secure. My point is that that foundation, given the erosion of the democratic norms we witness, can no longer be taken for granted. And the result is a kind of existential insecurity that we have never had to countenance before. We have lost our moorings, our anchorage, and have entered into an Alice in Wonderland political reality. We're in a Dada world. And with that loss of security comes a roster of emotional and psychological effects. Getting back to Michelle Goldberg's piece, she writes, quote, I reached out to a number of therapists who said they are seeing a politically induced misery in their patients. 3 years ago, said Karen Starr, a psychologist who practices in Manhattan and Long Island, some of her patients were in, quote, a state of alarm, but that changed into, quote, more of a chronic feeling that is bordering on despair, end quote. Among those most affected, she said, are Holocaust survivors, not surprisingly, she sees. It's about, quote, it's about this general feeling that the institutions that we rely on to protect us from a dangerous individual might fail, end quote, she said. And as the writer says, Goldberg says, these feelings of fear and despair are not merely the possession of middle-class white folks, but African Americans as well, for whom, quoting another therapist who works primarily with black women, quote, the political situation they report is always in the room. How could it not be, okay, given, again, Trump's racism? You know, I mean, he's so cruel. I've read an article in the Atlantic outlining a history of his racist expressions in one of them, and his intolerances in one of them is absolutely extraordinary. To demonstrate his cruelty, in one of his buildings, he discovered that in the elevator, there were little braille markings at the floors so that blind people could know which button to push, which floor to go to. And he demanded that that braille be removed because he did not want blind people living in his place. I mean, could you imagine, I mean, the pettiness? I mean, that's the mentality of this individual. Okay, but I should say we don't have to go into a therapist's office to find these testimonies. I will share with you that I've had such discussions with the members of this community who are very concerned and emotional about it. It's leached into their emotional lives and their family. So the question is, bringing this to an end, how are we to respond to the despair and insecurity, if not the fear, that emanates from the political realities that we confront and leach their way into our psyches and our emotions? Well, in the first instance, succumbing to despair and inactivity, I got to tell you, is not the answer. Okay, don't succumb to it. That's it. That's the first rule. Okay. To begin, our emotions are often tagged to our beliefs, and here I think our humanist convictions can be helpful to us. It's a tenet of humanism, in my view, that the future is an open future, and that there is simply no determinism in how the future will play out. No one can know or predict with full confidence how the future will eventuate. I'm reminded, for example, that virtually not a single pundit or political scientist predicted the fall of the Soviet Union even 5 years before it occurred, even though that event was a world-shaping event. History moves back and forth in spirals and zigzags, and the political winds that move in one direction in one period can reverse direction and move in the opposite in the next. The worst political conditions do not necessarily give rise to even worse ones, but Phoenix-like, indeed history can experience a renaissance. For example, the mid-20th century, with the emergence of fascism, Nazism, the Holocaust, and the slaughter of over 60 million people in World War II, was arguably the nadir, the really bottom point of the entire career, 10,000-year career of human civilization. But shortly thereafter, it gave birth to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which extended dignity and rights to all human beings without consideration of race, class, religion, gender, political view, or any other qualifications which history had used to legitimize inequality and discrimination from time immemorial. The Universal Declaration became a signpost for a sequence of liberation movements that ushered in the decolonization of countries in Asia and Africa, the equality of minorities, women, gays, the disabled, and others who have been historically marginalized. If one lived in continental Europe in the mid-1930s, I suspect few would have predicted the emergence of the equality movements that have characterized Western society, at least, or indeed global society, in recent decades. In short, sustaining a belief that however dark the present moment may be, the sun can shine tomorrow opens the doors, I think, to hope and is a pathway out of despair. We live in the time of Trump, but there will be a time after Trump, and we will confront, I argue, a different landscape, a changed landscape. But another approach out of despair, as implied, is through the course of action. The older I have become, I must admit, the more I've become a behaviorist in my understanding of human emotions. If one is depressed, I don't think the best way to overcome one's depression is by trying to think your way out of it. Okay, I really don't think so. Rather, I think a better way is to try to summon your will, if you can, get oneself out of bed, and move one's body from here to there. Moving your body through space changes, I believe, your emotional composition, your emotional furniture, right? I really do think that action, that is doing something, can and does transform our moods and emotions. Consequently, the best way to overcome politically based despair is to become politically active and involved, remembering that you are joining with millions of others who are actively committed to the same causes. Indeed, the grim reality I'm expressing is not universally held by Americans. If I can make reference to the newspaper, with the emergence of Trump, subscriptions to the New York Times went up tremendously. I see that as a small datum, but I see that as a sign of hope that people indeed, there's a large swath of America who is not bought in to this insanity. Right? Okay. so as to become politically active, I'm saying, and working with others. In short, the response to despair is action. Not only will you be making a substantive difference to the cause you believe in, you will be transforming your emotions at the same time and be putting yourself into a better place. And when it comes to the power of reason, I personally refuse to give up on it. I won't give up on it. There's a quote from Sigmund Freud's Future of an Illusion, one of his better books, okay, wherein he says, and I love this quote, he says, "The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but there's something unusual about this voice in that it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. Ultimately, after endless rebuffs, it succeeds. This is one of the few points in which we may be optimistic about the future of humankind." And Freud was a very dire pessimist, but he was optimistic that the persistence and stubbornness of intellect and reason ultimately will indeed have a hearing, even perhaps in a day when we're experiencing, it confronts the avalanche of bad information coming our way in conspiracy. I think when it comes to our commitments to liberal democracy, we've got to simply stick to our guns and do so with a sense of confidence and greater militancy, okay? We've got to basically commit ourselves to our fundamental values and not give up on them. One thing that I think is very important in that regard, and it's a footnote, is I would like to say, I think one of the greatest problems in America is the incredible disparity between wealth and those who are the top 1% and everyone else. I think that closes the doors to opportunity, generates despair, turns people back on their own tribal groups and so on, their own narrow political opinions. We've got to overcome that. And one way to do it, and this is just sort of a political remedy, is we've got to restore the union movement in this country. Only 7% of American workers are now unionized. Unions, not in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, were one of the few political organizations that, if we're trying to talk about healing divisions, that actually transcended many divisions in American life, including racial ones. And I think what we've got to do, I think the salvific role, the salutary role of unions is extremely important. And so a lot of the work we have to do has to be done on equalizing the economy, strengthening the labor movement, and so on, as a vehicle to trying to heal the despair and division in American life. And lastly, and this may sound somewhat counterintuitive, it's something I employ, I think we need to rediscover for ourselves those engagements beyond political activism that can help restore our emotional lives. The problems we face, and the list is virtually endless, can literally overwhelm us if we don't take time out for ourselves. Thinking about global warming, for example, can simply smother us with a sense that the apocalypse is virtually at hand. I mean, if you want to feel depressed, just read a few articles about global warming. And for that reason, I think we need to temporarily retreat into those activities that restore our souls, be it the contemplation of beauty, a love of music, taking a walk in the woods, engaging in sports, escaping into a good book, and among my favorites, simply spending quality time with good friends. Okay, I think we need to do that in order to restore ourselves and to be more effective activists in the causes that we need to do. In the final analysis, we simply do not know, nor does anyone else, what the future will bring, and we should find some consolation in the reality that we can only do what we can do, and if we try our best, nothing more can be reasonably asked of us. I'd like to end my little talk with a quote from one of my favorite historians, Howard Zinn, whom I usually don't go to for spiritual inspiration, but I really love this quote, and I think it's very useful. Howard Zinn had said, quote, "To be hopeful in bad times is based on the fact that human history is not only cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future," he says, "is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory."